Thank you, John. As I'm sure most of you know, like you said, Mike's gone. I'm filling in for him today. We're doing Geopolitical Times of Christ. So what we want to do is, there's lots of things in the New Testament that it just, St. Peter and St. Paul, when they're writing scriptures, they're writing it to people who live in the area. If I just start throwing out names, I say, Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, things like that, you have a picture in your head of who they are and what that means and what they did. And so if you read Luke 2 and say Jesus was born in the time of Tiberius Caesar when Quirinius was governor of Syria, that doesn't mean anything to us that it may have meant to them. So we're kind of wanting to get you to the point where you get an idea of the context. And I'm not sure how long we'll go today. If we have good discussion, maybe we'll go the whole time. Maybe we can get out early. We'll see. But Mike did go over it a little bit. Just for a little bit of a recap, we started kind of with Hellenization. You end the Old Testament at Malachi with he's kind of one of the last prophets, and then you kind of wake up and all of a sudden Rome is in charge of Judea and Christ is born when Quirinius is governor of Syria. And it's like, whoa, what happened? So we talked about Alexander's conquest and the Greek influence, the philosophy and the gods and things like that, and then all kind of the political infighting and the factions that come up even within Judaism itself in response to this. And last week, Mike talked about Rome, kind of the rise of Rome, their political philosophy, very much a realpolitik. It's like you're either our friend or our enemy type thing. There aren't very many, there's not much in between. You'll do what we say, or it'll be a clash of civilizations, like Carthage, where they just sent wave after wave after wave of soldier until one of the great powers was dead. And it was kind of this Roman war machine that helped Judea gain their independence. So you have the Maccabean revolt in 170s to 150s BC, and they're being violent and suing for peace. And you have Judea here, and it's part of you have the Ptolemies who are all over Africa. And then they're part of the Seleucid Empire, which goes all the way up into Turkey and down the Tigris and the Euphrates into Persia. And they're just this little bitty strip of land here. But Rome over here talks to the Seleucids. They're on and off war with the Seleucids, and they say, don't touch Judea. You will expand no more. If you touch Judea, you made an enemy of Rome. So that's why Judea and the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, they have a tenuous relationship. The Jews really have their own kingdom, more or less, for about 100 years. It's a weak kingdom surrounded by stronger kingdoms. That's just awful. This is just awful. So they're kind of puppets of other kingdoms, but they have their own coins, they have kings, high priests, and those are kind of the guys that we're going to talk about. We'll talk a little bit about the lineage, going up to Herod the Great, which, as you'll probably find out, maybe not an appropriate name if you're on the side of the Judeo-Christian faction. But he's referred to as Herod the Great because there's multiple Herods. There's Herod Antipas and things like that, but he's the first Herod who rules for 30 years, and you recognize him from the story when he tries to kill baby Jesus. So we want to get to that and kind of explain what's going on. I want to make sure I don't have anything I missed in the recap. This is all building, for us, this builds to Christ and his message. For the Jews, what this builds to is the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. They have a full revolt against the Romans and try to throw off the yoke, and the Romans completely crush them, devastate the temple. The Jews are dispersed. 70 AD is like the post-temple Judaism. You'll hear people talk about post-temple Judaism. It's a completely different mindset than when you have a temple. So that's what it is talking about for them. So we start with John Hyrcanus. I will spell it, and I will say it different than Mike does. And anytime you hear anyone talk about them, they will pronounce it different. I say Hyrcanus, or what do I say? Hyrcanus. That's what I learned. Mike will call them Hyrcanus. It depends on where you're from in the world, I suppose.
Should I call them Hyrcanus?
Yes, I probably could be. I don't know. They're really old guys whose names we found on coins. So, I mean, coins don't talk. But he was the son of Simon, who was a Maccabee. And Hyrcanus begins, that's a popular name in this period. And he was one of the great kings of Judea. He was like, if you think of the Judean kingdom during its independent period, you're probably talking about the rule of John Hyrcanus. And he's like 105 to 75 BC-ish. We're in that, maybe a little bit before that, but that's the area that we're talking about. Oh no, he actually gets us up to 105. So he is more like 135 to 105 BC. That's my guy. The next person will be at that time period. And so he kind of makes Judea his own. He's the one who kind of deals with the Seleucids, says, hey, back off, we're backed by Rome. He builds roads, he expands. That basically the beginning, when he takes power, the land that they control is just around Jerusalem and near the Jordan River. And he's the one that expands the Judean kingdom all the way up into Galilee and the Golan Heights and down to the Gaza Strip and things like that. Kind of makes it was much closer to what they would have thought of as the original home of Israel. Then when he dies, he turns his power over to his wife and the high priesthood over to his son. So John Hyrcanus, he didn't really call himself a king. He would have called himself the high priest. And if you look him up on Wikipedia, or if you were to see him written on the coins or whatever, that would be his title. John Hyrcanus, High Priest of Judea. But at that time, High Priest was also kind of the highest political office. He was the ruler of the militaries, he was making the coins, kind of enforcing the laws, things like that. When he dies, he decides, you know what, because it went so well when Israel did it before, let's split church and state. Which is interesting for us to talk about because in our modern world, we think of that as a good thing. Church and state should be split. We look at the Middle Ages and all the issues that happens, but when it was done in the Old Testament times, it didn't, at least for Israel, it didn't seem to work out very well. So when he dies, he gives political power. Yes, gives political power to his wife. And then he gives the high priesthood to his son, Aristobulus. Well, unfortunately, or Aristobulus is what Mike would call it. So I will do my best to call him what Mike would call him. Aristobulus was not a kind man, and you have to look too. This is a Greek name. You know, you begin the Maccabean revolt, they're anti-Greek. They want to go back to the old ways, and yet a few generations later, you're having kids named Aristobulus. Aristobulus says, forget the split of church and state. I want power. I'm the son of my father. I don't want my brothers to have power. He imprisons his mother, the wife of John Hyrcanus, his mother, and starves her to death in prison. So we have a long family history of murdering for political influence. Herod doesn't just come up with this idea. And he, along with his brothers, so he imprisons several of his brothers and his mother, and in order to gain power, he starves them to death. Unfortunately for Aristobulus, he dies just shortly after doing that. So he's only ruling for like a year. So this is all happening around 100 BC-ish. So 100 years before Christ. Rome is finally kind of coming on the scene. They've beaten Carthage, they've beaten the Greeks, they're spreading. The Seleucids and the Ptolemies are really kind of dying down a little bit. And this is happening, the turmoil. Aristobulus dies, and his wife, actually, Alexandra Salome, marries his basically last surviving brother, Alexander. And Alexander is the king, or the high priest. Again, the waters get kind of murky on religious versus secular power, but his wife Alexandra really kind of starts to gain influence. And when Alexander finally dies, she actually takes power for herself. Unfortunately, we talked before about the Pharisees and the Sadducees. How when we read the Bible, Judaism is kind of this monolith. You know, the Sanhedrin is against Christ. They're against the disciples. They're for the temple. They're for the law, etc. But really, there's a lot of different things going on in Judaism at this time. And Alexander doesn't help that. Alexander is a pro-Sadducee and sets up reforms in the city. He makes sure all the Sadducees are in places of power, and he ends up murdering 800 Pharisees. This was before the Pharisees really had much political influence. So the Pharisees actually enter a time of persecution, within a few generations of Jesus. I mean, 100 years ago, that's like World War I for us. And we can think about, or we even would talk about the Boston Massacre or things like that. If your group is murdered, literally slaughtered by someone in power, that's difficult for you to move past that. But Alexander eventually passes away, and Alexandra, his wife, ends up taking all the power for herself around 75 BC. So you had all this turmoil for 20 to 30 years, and Alexandra calms things down for about 10 years or so. And I know there's a lot of names, and that's kind of the point, I think, that Mike is trying to get at. This is, you throw around a lot of names in the biblical stories and just to get context, but just get the idea that this is not the Judea of Solomon. We think of that, and it's Old Testament versus New Testament, but this is a place where there is constant political infighting. There's puppet kings being put in by different empires, which we'll talk in a little bit. This is a very difficult place to be a Jew, frankly. So what are our thoughts about this before we move on? What would it mean to be a Jew if you're kings? Supposedly, you're independent. I mean, you're kind of influenced by the other people, but your kings, the high priest, is murdering Pharisees and killing, starving their mothers in prison. What does a faithful Jew do in that situation?
Seems like an easier question when you look back to the beginning of the Maccabean revolt, and it's like they were coming in and killing people who didn't or who were circumcising their kids, trying to put an end to it.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, let's rebel. We're all we're not for that Greek influence, and now it's Aristobulus, Alexander marries Alexandra, all the Jewish people. I don't know.
Yeah.
I think they're looking for a Messiah.
Yeah, they are. And that's a big thing that we'll talk about. Why would you call me right now? Where that's the whole theme of next week's lecture, actually. So we'll get to Zionism and the quest for the Messiah. But can you understand why? And the Maccabees even said that. Some people thought of them as kind of mini messiahs, but they said, this is not us. We're just kind of getting to where we need to be, but once the Messiah comes, we'll step back. we will gladly give him power. And you can understand why people were yearning. Throughout this time, there were all kinds of false messiahs coming up. You can see why someone's like, surely someone can fix this. You know, so if this is what your high priest is doing, can you see, I mean, would you still take your sacrifices to the temple? I mean, I think probably yes, but what do you, at least for me, but what would you think of that? It's difficult. It's a difficult question. The hopelessness that and like my grandpa said, these are my grandparents, and by the way, Howard and Bart. But like Pop said, your only hope is that God will save you, because we've tried man after man after man after man after man, and it is just not working out for us, and it's only going to get worse. So Alexandra calms things down a little bit in 75 BC. She reigns until around 67 BC, and she is pro-Pharisee, and she basically institutes the Sanhedrin, which is kind of the unified Jewish body politic. It's similar, it's kind of a religious senate. The Sanhedrin was more or less a thing before Alexandria, but it was mostly just Sadducees, and they're just kind of rendering opinions on things or rubber stamping things. It's in this time period that the Sanhedrin comes into place. This is a place, think of this like Congress. You know, you hate each other, Republicans and Democrats, you know, or, you know, you can think 1840s United States, you know, free states and slave states, but there's going to be a certain number of each of you put in this room to make a decision, and you're not allowed out of the room until you can play nice, that kind of thing. And you may recognize the Sanhedrin as the body before which Christ goes in his trial. It's the Sanhedrin, the Pharisees and the Sadducees working in alignment to say Christ should be crucified. Which again, you know, is really a big deal when two of your factions have been fighting for so long, even to the point of death. There must be something really radical going on for you to both agree this is our enemy that needs to be taken care of. She reinvigorated the Sanhedrin. Salome dies just a few years after taking over, and then we enter a period of civil war, true to civil war. So she has two sons. Aristobulus II, because the first one went so well, and Hyrcanus II would be John Hyrcanus II. And this is where we start to see the outside influences. Judea really starts to lose their independence. So we talked like 100 years before this, Rome what they would have called it is guaranteed the independence of Judea. They said, we'll make sure none of the other powers mess with you. And kind of like the United States did 100 years ago with South American countries. Don't worry about it. We will make sure that no European powers come and take over your land. And they're like, oh, this is great. And then as soon as you make a president that we don't like, then we will move our armies in and take care of business. And that's like, whoa, I don't remember that being part of the deal. This is how, and this was 100 years before this. But Rome has remembered that. You know, this is a civilizational thing, institutional. Rome doesn't deal with people. It deals with contracts and states and civilizations. So there's this civil war between Aristobulus and John Hyrcanus, and they both end up appealing to Rome. They say, hey, guarantor, we've got an issue. We would like a neutral third party to come in and arbitrate for this. And the General Pompey from Rome says, I would be glad to do that. Thank you. You may remember Pompey as being a member of the First Triumvirate. He was butting heads with Julius Caesar. Well, he started out being buddy-buddies, and they kind of ran the Roman Republic together. and then they end up fighting, and Caesar won. But Pompey, marches in basically, and he looks at the two, and he looks at Aristobulus, and Aristobulus has a big army behind him, and he's charismatic, and he speaks loud, and he is forceful. And then he sees John Hyrcanus with no people behind him, and he's feeble, and he is very polite and asking for forgiveness and things like that. And Pompey looks and says, I think I like the weenie better. I think this looks like a Jewish revolt waiting to happen. If we can get this guy in power, I think I can pull some strings. So he puts in weenie John Hyrcanus II, backs him, actually sieges Jerusalem. Aristobulus is holed up in Jerusalem with his army, and Hyrcanus II, along with Pompey, siege Jerusalem. They surrender. Pompey basically marches right into the temple and puts in a Roman eagle right in front of the door. Not in the Holy of Holies. He didn't sacrifice a pig on the Holy of Holies. Not as bad as the Seleucids. But there is an SPQR golden eagle right outside the entrance of the temple. Just in case anyone forgot who installed the high priest. So again, John Hyrcanus II, this is when Judea basically becomes a client state of Rome. It's not on paper necessarily. He is still the high priest, technically the political ruler, but Pompey is there across the Mediterranean saying, remember who put you in power. And it was at this time too, if you ever read the New Testament or the book of Romans, you wonder, how is there a group of Jews in Rome? Who is Paul talking to? It was at this time. Pompey takes Aristobulus II prisoner and a lot of his followers and takes them back as prisoners to Rome. And what Mike said is they were taken back as slaves, but they only lasted as slaves for a generation because they just weren't worth it. They wouldn't eat your food. They wouldn't pray to your gods. They wouldn't fight your enemies. They'd sit there and cross their arms and say, I will sooner die than eat your pork. And the Romans are like, what the heck? You are too expensive to deal with. So the Jews, they get taken back to Rome as slaves, and the Romans get so disgusted with them that they're like, yeah, not worth it. Most of them end up buying their independence, which their owners agreed to because they were just more pain than they were worth. And there could have been as many as 50,000 Jews in Rome at the time of Jesus. And it's a city of 1 million people, so that's obviously a very small minority. But there was a synagogue in Rome, and it was because of this. So Rome gets a little piece of Judea. Judea gets a little piece of Rome. So this is how, and you can kind of see this as, God is preparing the spread of the gospel. There's these synagogues in Greece and in Rome and in Spain and North Africa where people like Peter and Paul can easily go and say, you know these scriptures, you know these prophecies, this is the Messiah. And that's fertile ground, and then these churches can sprout up. So what do you think about that? I mean, on the one hand, you say, boy, this is awful. It's just Pompey coming in and picking the weakling to set up a Roman client state, and the civil war between brothers is just awful. But on the other hand, God ends up using it for good. So
He always does.
yeah. Any other examples we can think of that from the Bible? Everything always goes to plan.
Many.
Yeah.
Paul didn't want to do what he did.
Yeah, Paul, right? Saul is going around killing Christians. And, let's say he killed 500 Christians. Terrible, awful, despicable man. Murderer. But he thought he was doing what was right. And, but because of that, he was able to have his conversion story and his such powerful message. And one of the best arguments that you can have for the historicity of Christ is that Saul doesn't make any sense. It makes sense maybe why his disciples would follow him, or the people that like Jesus, but the conversion of someone like Saul, just all of a sudden, that doesn't make any sense. And because God allowed him to kill these 500 faithful Christians, or whatever it may have been, easily 500 million people have been influenced by Paul's message. So, and it might not be on that level, but, kind of think of that. But also remember, for us, it's easy for us to see the good here on the other side. Excuse me. But if you're a Jewish soldier for Aristobulus, and you're being taken as a prisoner back to Rome because you were defending the temple, it sure looks like God has abandoned you. Who else would have the thought, if you're being marched as a slave back to Rome for defending the temple, that God has abandoned you? That would be a tempting thought. Praise the Lord that we don't have to deal with those thoughts today, at least not on an institutional level. So, Pompey puts in Hyrcanus II as high priest and leaves with many Jewish prisoners. As many of you already know, Pompey then gets involved in a civil war, Rome with Julius Caesar. Hyrcanus is buddies with Pompey. He says, Pompey, I'm your man. Have some armies, have some lands, have some forts, etc. And there's another guy named Antipater. And he likes Caesar. Antipater the Idumean. He's not even a Jew. He kind of converted Judaism. He's a semi-Jew. He would have, 1,000 years ago, or 1,000 years before this, he would have been called an Edomite. But this is a bordering region, not really a Jew, which that's a subject of discussion in itself. There's lots of people who were Jews and not really Jews, and you have to wonder what those definitions are at some point. But in any case, it's very complicated, as civil wars always are. But Pompey and Caesar get in a fight. And this guy backs Pompey. And this guy backs Caesar. And Antipater, he never becomes king, but as Caesar comes prominent, starts defeating Pompey in wars, he places Antipater basically as the secular leader. He's not the high priest. Hyrcanus II maintains the high priesthood, but Caesar appoints Antipater basically as he calls it the ethnarch. He's the ruler of the ethnicity of the Jews. He's favored by Caesar. And Antipater the Idumean has his sons help him out, the most important of whom is Herod the Great. And this is all happening 50-ish BC, when the clash is happening, the civil war in Rome. And so, so there's a civil war going on with Rome, and then war breaks out between Rome and the Parthian Empire. So this is kind of a time of tension in Judea, where Hyrcanus is the high priest and Antipater is the secular ruler, and then the Parthians, the Jewish population sides with the Parthians, and so does John Hyrcanus. And Herod and Antipater actually have to flee to Rome. Let's see. Antipater is a citizen. Yeah, and Hyrcanus, okay, so I take that back. Hyrcanus didn't side with the Parthians. The Jewish population sided with the Parthians. Hyrcanus was still on Pompey's team, but the Jews rose up and were like, no, we like the Parthians better, the Romans are awful. And Hyrcanus actually gets captured by the Parthians, taken prisoner to Babylon, and they chop his ears off. And so he can't be high priest anymore. This is not a spiritual people. For Judaism, it's still very physical, the physical presence of God. If you're supposed to be the one hearing God's messages for the people, you need ears. So the Parthians, for like 3 years, the high priest of the Jews, is imprisoned in Babylon with no ears. So again, hopelessness. Hopelessness. And the Parthians put in another puppet king named Antigonus. You don't necessarily need to write his name down. He's not going to last. The Parthians win this little bit of the war because the Jewish people revolt. They take John Hyrcanus, the second prisoner, put in their little puppet king. Herod goes to Rome. And he says, hey, my father was your friend. Parthians aren't your friend. Are you going to put up with a Parthian king in Jerusalem? And Rome says, no, you're right. That's a good point. You're the king now. So by Roman decree, Herod is declared the king. And he has a short war with Antigonus, and he eventually wins. And in 37 BC, Herod becomes the ethnarch of the Jews, king of the Jews. Has anyone heard the phrase king of the Jews before? Okay. Then Herod gets himself in trouble. But Herod, for the first time in this line, manages to wiggle his way out of it. Because Herod marches with 2 Roman legions in Jerusalem to take it over, kind of like Caesar did on Rome. So this is not Jewish people rising up in a revolt. Herod is very insecure for his whole reign, because the Jewish people know, as well as he does, the only reason he's king is because he had 2 Roman legions that he marched into Jerusalem. And if it weren't for the Romans, he wouldn't be king. But he is king. And then there's another civil war, and Herod picks the wrong side. Augustus fights with Mark Antony. Mark Antony was one of the guys that vouched for Antipater, his dad. So Herod's an Antony guy. He backs him. Antony's there, Antony and Cleopatra in Egypt. He sends them armies, sends them money, etc. Antony loses big time. So then Augustus calls Herod to Rome and puts him before his throne, and Augustus basically says, why should I allow you to be king? Why should I not kill you on the spot? And Herod goes to him, and Herod's brilliant. He says, look what a good friend I was to Mark Antony, just because of something he did for my dad. Imagine how good of a friend I'll be to you if you let me keep my life and stay king of the Jews. Augustus is like, that's a really good point. I'm impressed by your loyalty. Rome appreciates loyalty. And it's not like he backed a Carthaginian. I mean, it's just politics, right? Nothing personal. So Herod, after conquering Jerusalem with 2 Roman legions, is now confirmed by the now Emperor Augustus. He is the king of the Jews, friend of the emperor. And he rules for the next 27 years. Herod is married something like 7 times. Has many sons. Most of his sons end up dying in mysterious circumstances. Not all. Many of his wives end up dying in mysterious circumstances. He builds many cities, Roman cities, port cities. He builds palaces for himself and fortresses all over Judea, and very Roman fortresses. So even though he's circumcised, even though his father was an Idumean, a pseudo-Jew, he calls himself the king of the Jews. That's why if you're a Herodian, they don't think that you're really a Jew. You really don't have your priorities in line. And then I'll just finish this up here, then we can discuss for the rest of it. Eventually, and obviously this gets to the birth of Christ. So you can see why, if wise men from probably Babylon which is, by the way, in Parthia, come to the palace in Jerusalem. They say, "Oh, great Herod, we've been told there's a new king of the Jews been born today in Bethlehem. We would like to see him and give him gifts." 30 years ago, the Parthians put in a king of the Jews. This is not a metaphorical situation. Herod was not afraid of someone coming to die on the cross and save us from our sins. Herod was afraid of Jewish revolt number 87 against him. And Herod's not going to put up with it. He said, no, no, no. I didn't let Pompey take it from me. I didn't let Mark Antony take it from me. And I'm certainly not going to let some Parthian-favored king of the Jews to take it from me. I don't care who he says he is. And that's why Herod murders all these Jewish boys. You say, how could a king murder so many little boys of his own dynasty, of his own people? They weren't his own people. He was an Idumean. He was a Roman asset. He was a psychopath, personally. And he was paranoid. And to his credit, the paranoia worked for him. He ruled for 27 years. And he had and secular studiers actually really like Herod, because he had lots of great building projects. Caesarea Maritima, the Caesarea on the sea, that was him. And a lot of the great statues. I mean, if you see things that were built in this time period in Judea, it was probably commissioned by Herod the Great. Herod the Great marched into Jerusalem with 2 Roman legions to claim the kinghood and begged Augustus, the emperor, to be king of the Jews, and murdered Jewish little boys to maintain his throne. Herod the Great. Herod the Great ends up dying eventually, of course. He has 3 sons that split up the power. The one who takes control of Judea is named Archelaus. Archelaus is even more of a dumpster fire than his father. Has all the personal misgivings without the political savvy or the engineering skills. And Rome says, you know what, we're done. No more kings of the Jews. We're going to put in a prefect. We're marching in our own armies with our own generals. A prefect is not a governor. A prefect is not a civil leader. A prefect is a general in charge of an army, in charge of an encampment. They said, you Jewish kings are too much trouble. We're going to put in our general, Pontius Pilate. From 200 years, we go from a independent Judea asking Rome, will you protect us from the Seleucids? To General Pontius Pilate ruling Jerusalem. And the temple has a golden eagle outside its door.
So that eagle's like there the whole time?
I don't know how long it's there, but I do remember the thing I read specifically said that eagles were put up around the city.
Okay.
In like important places as reminders that, and again, that's how Rome rolls. Like, and that's the thing, if you're friends with Rome, if you play nice, they're great. Their taxes are pretty light, they let you worship your own gods. I mean, they're not like the Assyrians or even the Seleucids. They don't march into the temple and make you eat pigs and, you know, say you can't sacrifice or anything like that. They build roads and aqueducts and you trade all over the empire. It's great. But your king better be loyal. So how do you think the common Jew, if you were learning this, if you were Jesus, or a peer of Jesus in school, and learning your Jewish history here, what would you be thinking of all this?
Hope Messiah is coming soon.
Yeah. For sure. You can see how the Pharisees, how the Sadducees might bum you out. If you're a Jew and you don't believe in resurrection, you don't believe in a new age of rule by God, that really bum you out. And it'd be tempting to be a Herodian. Is there anything really wrong? I didn't kill anybody. I don't speak for Herod, but the road is right here. Is it so bad if I go out into the streets and say, yay, Herod, when he walks by? I'm still doing my sacrifices, still circumcising my kids. What's the big deal? We're just trying to get by. Right? The Jeremiah principle. Let's make gardens. Let's make friends. Sit, calm down, be married. Don't fight the man. It doesn't seem to apply, does it? How do you think they would have viewed Herod the Great? What would you think if someone claimed to be king of the Jews?
Was it public knowledge that he slaughtered all those little kids?
In the areas he did, yeah, I mean, it'd be hard to miss. It wasn't all over Judea, but it was specifically, if I recall, specifically in that area. And it was only of a specific age group. But again, unfortunately, this wouldn't have been all that uncommon. This is 100 years of political turmoil. To be someone's political enemy means that your life is in danger. And Rome, again, I can't hardly blame Rome. I mean, they made things a lot worse starting all the way back. But after all the stuff with Herod and stuff, it's like, oh, whoa, time out. We didn't sign up for this. Let's just put a Roman in charge, because this is getting too complicated. There's too many Hyrcanos and Aristobulus and Herods and Antipas and... Makes us thankful for the hope that we have, don't you think? What if you were a disciple and someone who claimed to be king of the Jews says, come follow me? Are you thinking that he's going to die on the cross for you? What does salvation mean? Get Romans out of here. Get the Herods out of here. Get the Aristobuluses out of here. You're the Messiah. The Maccabees talked about you 150 years ago. Finally, it's about time. Get these people out of here. And then Jesus and the fishermen say that. And then he says, oh, how about a tax collector? Come follow me. And then people are like, wait, tax collector? You know he works for Herod. No, I see. No, he's not temple tax. He collects taxes for Pilate. Jesus says, no, I know. Give to Caesar what's Caesar's. That doesn't make any sense. Jesus doesn't make sense. That's partially what we'll talk about next week. The hope for the Messiah and the different, we'll relook at the factions and what Jesus meant to each group of people. Any final thoughts before we leave? Again, there's not as much to just take home in your pocket and this is how you can change your life today. But this is just to get you to ponder as you read the New Testament. You understand Peter, just a fisherman on the lake. To us, we don't know anything about him, but you can kind of know. You know what he was learning in history. He was learning the Greek poets and sacrificing at the temple, and learning Roman history and the history of how Rome protected Jews from the Seleucids, and then Herod rose up and built all these great cities, and in the back of your mind, this is just propaganda. He killed all these Jews. This is crazy. Dad told me he's a bad guy. And then this guy comes. There's this baby born to be king of the Jews. There's this man who says, come follow me, I'm your salvation. I'm the Messiah.
This is a good reminder to me of how we always hear it from our 2000-year-old perspective, and the whole point of Jesus hanging on the cross, but while he was hanging on the cross, it was such a mess.
And think about it. He's the King of the Jews. He's the Messiah. He's your salvation.
Is he the king of the Jews?
Yeah.
Let's just say he said he was king of the Jews.
Yeah. And then the Romans kill him. He's executed. Boy, was I wrong. I thought he was different. He's just another John Hyrcanus II. Another new king of the Jews. We thought it was good stuff. We thought he's another Mattathias Maccabee. He lived a good life, but his flame burned out too long. We were wrong. He was not the Messiah.
That's what it would seem like for 3 days.
Exactly. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for this chance to come together. Thank you, Lord, for hope, Lord. This time of hopelessness, Lord. We thank you for the glimmer of hope that you gave to the Jewish people, even in the midst of all this turmoil, for those that were willing to see it, Lord. Thank you for faithfully carrying them through. Thank you for the hope that we have in Jesus Christ. Thank you that he is the King of the Jews and our Messiah. And we thank you that he did not conform to the image that we had of a King of the Jews and the Messiah, but to your image. That you rose above the petty squabbles of this earth. Help us, Lord, to ponder these things and ponder the message that Tony will give us in fellowship today, that we would always draw closer to you. In Jesus' name, amen. Thanks, guys. That's all we got. Yeah, I would have probably emerged this week and next week if I were in Mike's shoes. But not making it short. Unfortunately, of all his lectures he's going to do today, this is one of the weakest ones. He's like this. But as far as like pre-knowledge, I had to do a lot of studying.
Good job, man. Good job.
Thanks.